Well, I can only talk about it symbolically to begin with, and that's, I think, not sufficient. But I hope as I move through the biblical series that I can zero in on that more and more particularly. But, I mean, the idea of the dying and resurrecting God is a very old idea. And it's echoed in such things as the imagery, say, of the phoenix, which burns itself up and then restores itself to its early form. And I think, speaking purely psychologically, that idea of the dying and resurrecting Savior is something like a reflection of the fact that in order to progress psychologically, you have to let go, especially in the face of obstacles, you have to let go of those things that are impeding your progress that might be very dear to your heart. You have to let them go and let them die, and then you have to let a new part of yourself be born. So, because when you're wrong, you have to let the part of you that's wrong die, and then a new part spring to life in some sense. It's a new part that's partly a union of your mind and a union of the information that's contained in the error that you committed. And it's like the birth in some sense of a new spirit. And so you could say that there's this idea that you have to have faith in Christ because Christ is the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through Him. What that means symbolically, as far as I can tell, is that you have to embrace the process of voluntary death and rebirth in order to continue moving forward properly in your life. And it's also that process of death and rebirth that rejuvenates the Father. And it's also that process of death and rebirth that produces the Father to begin with, if you think about the Father as the symbol of culture. So, at minimum, the idea of the resurrected Christ is the idea that you should identify not with that part of yourself that's stagnant and dead and that already knows, but is prone to error. You should identify with that part of yourself that's always stretching beyond what you currently know and has the faith to let go of old certainties so that new patterns of being can be brought into place. And so, now, that's a purely psychological explanation, and I think I've made the case in my biblical lectures that I'm striving for a psychological interpretation at the moment. My experience with the biblical stories is that there are layers of depth in them that are sufficiently profound, perhaps because of the staggering hyperlinking of the text and its association with almost the entire corpus of Western literature, that as you keep digging, you find more and more. And so I don't know what to make of the more metaphysical claims, but I'm going to leave it at that because I don't know. It's only speculation. See, I guess it is that I really don't believe that we understand consciousness, and we don't understand its role in the cosmos. It could be that consciousness is just an epiphenomena of materialist processes, but there's a couple of things to me that seems to mitigate against that explanation. And the first is that we don't have an account of consciousness that's useful. We have no idea how the material substrate of the brain produces this awareness and self-awareness that seems to be crucially important in the existence of the cosmos, insofar as if there's nothing to experience something, it's very difficult to say in what way that it exists. You need a viewer and an observer, and scientists sort of gerrymander that by positing a hypothetical observer when they talk about phenomena where there is no actual observer. And so consciousness could be just an epiphenomena, but it could also be something central to the nature of being, and certainly mythological stories present it that way, that there's nature, that would be nurture from a scientific perspective, and there's the social world, that would be the great father from the mythological perspective, and that's all there is from a scientific perspective. But from a mythological perspective, there's active consciousness, and that's associated with the idea of the logos. And the logos seems to be something like, if you think about it as consciousness, it seems to be this thing that encounters the potential of future being and then determines, at least in part, how to shape it. Now, obviously, we're constrained in many ways. We can't shape things in any old way, but we can certainly advance in the direction of our imagination in quite a staggering and compelling manner. And then you might say, well, is that real? Is the idea that we have a consciousness and that it's free in some incomprehensible sense, and that it plays a role in constructing the cosmos, is that real? And then I would say, well, it depends on what you mean by real, but I would also point out that you act as if it's real, and that our functional legal systems, like the legal systems on the West, are predicated on the acceptance of its reality. And it was an idea that took many, many thousands of years to emerge. You know, first of all, the only sovereign was the king and God, and then the nobles became sovereign, and then men became sovereign, and then with the Christian Revolution, every individual soul became sovereign. And that idea of individual sovereignty and worth is the core presupposition of our legal system and our cultural systems. And so we all walk around acting as if every one of us is a divine center of logos, because we give each other the respect of individual citizens who are sovereign and that are equal before the law. And the funny thing is if someone doesn't treat you that way, it treats you as if your free will is an illusion, or refuses to regard you as someone who plays an active part in choosing the outcome of their life, then you get very, very annoyed. And so if it's an illusion, and perhaps it is, we don't understand an alternative to it, and it's unbelievably functional. So, okay, so back to love. Well, we'll make the case that limitation is necessary for being, and then we can make the case that tragedy is an inevitable consequence of limitation, and then we might say, well, is being worth the tragedy? And I think the answer yes to that is love, and the answer no to that is the opposite of love, because when you love someone, you love them in spite of or even because of their vulnerability. Not that you don't want them to transcend that, because you do, and I think that love is the acceptance of the price of being. It's the way you manifest your acceptance of the price of being, because if you love someone, you know, they have their vulnerabilities like every human being, but your basic judgment is that despite the fact that they have these vulnerabilities that are even fatal and that are certainly tragic, that it's better that they were than that they weren't. And I think that's the right attitude to have towards being itself. It's an optimistic attitude, and I think it has to be predicated on faith, because I don't think that you can necessarily derive that conclusion by looking at the available evidence. The available evidence is kind of 50-50 in many situations. But I can tell you, if you adopt the other attitude that being is unjustifiable, then that leads you down a very, very dark road, and then you soon start to work in a way that makes things far more intolerable than they should be. So that's my answer to that. Any tips on avoiding booze? Yeah, that's a real tough one. Well, I would say a couple of things. There is a drug, if you're a binge drinker, there is a drug called naltrexone that you could consider, and you take naltrexone every day. It doesn't really have any psychological effect on you, but if you're a naltrexone responder, what will happen is that it will dampen your positive response to alcohol. So some people who are alcoholic, many of them have a very pronounced opiate effect from alcohol. It looks like it's mediated by beta endorphin, and naltrexone is an opiate blocker. And so what naltrexone seems to do is dampen the positive response. And the positive response, which would be opiate and then dopaminergic, is the same response that makes you want to keep drinking when you start drinking. So if you're one of those people that has a drink and then has to have another one and then has to have another one, and soon all your money's gone, then the probability that you have an opiate response is pretty high. And naltrexone can help with that. Generally, when people take naltrexone, they keep drinking. They try to control, but they keep drinking, and they learn over time that the alcohol doesn't have the same punch. It's still pleasant, but it doesn't have the same overwhelming punch that it did at one point. So that would be one suggestion, and it's worth trying. The other is, like, make a plan. I would say do the future authoring program, because it isn't that you're trying to avoid booze exactly. It's that you're trying to restructure your whole life, because if you're a drinker, then all your friends are drinkers, and you're used to drinking in every social situation, and the places that you go to socialize are places that you drink, and like it's really built in as a whole set of habits. And so what you have to do is kind of redesign your life, and you have to think of things. You can't just stop drinking. You have to figure out what you're going to start doing instead of drinking. There's a hole that you have to fill, and the future authoring program will also help you figure out what your life could look like in the absence of alcohol, and what kind of hell you could end up in if you keep drinking and it causes all the problems that it can cause. And I think you really need to, you need to think through the hell that can occur, and you have to think through how your life could be valuable without alcohol, so that you can be motivated enough to try to regulate it. And I would also say, if you fail and slip, don't berate yourself and beat yourself up. Just start quitting again, because if you could cut your alcohol intake down 75%, that's a hell of a lot better than zero. And often people go all or nothing, just like they do when they're quitting cigarettes, and they'll quit for a month and then have a cigarette, and they'll say, oh my God, now I've broken the pact, and then they'll smoke a whole pack and they'll be smoking again. You don't have to do that. You can just decide that you slipped and that you're going to get back on the wagon again. And it can take a long time, but I do believe that you need a better vision of life, right? You have to find something to do that's better than alcohol, and that might take some real consideration, especially if alcohol is a very potent drug for you. And I would also say, don't hesitate to try the naltrexone. It's got a pretty decent clinical history, and it's basically harmless. So,
and he spoke roughly unto them, and he said unto them, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan, to buy food. And Joseph knew who his brothers were, but they didn't know who he was. And they came back to Jacob their father and told him all that befell him, and said, the man who's lord of the country spoke roughly to us and took us for spies. And we said to him, we're true men, honest men. We're not spies. We be 12 brothers, sons of our fathers. One is not, and the youngest is this day with our father in the land of Canaan. And the man said, here's how I'll know that you're honest men. Leave one of the brothers here with me, and take some food for the famine of your households, and be gone. And then bring your youngest brother to me. Then I'll know that you're not spies, but that you're honest men. And I'll deliver the other brother, and ye shall trade in the land, so you don't have to starve to death. And it came to pass, as they emptied their sacks, that behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when both they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. So they had bought food from Joseph, and he gave them the food, and then he put all their money back in their sacks, which I could imagine would worry them to some degree. And Jacob said, me you have already bereaved of my children. Joseph is not, and Simeon is not. Now you'll take Benjamin away. All these things are against me. And Reuben spake unto his father, saying, slay my 2 sons if I bring him not to thee. Deliver him into my hand, and I will bring him to thee again. And he said, no, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he's left alone. If mischief befall him by the way in the which you shall go, then you shall bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to the grave. Now, there's a hint. See, what happens in the last part of the Jacob story, the Joseph story, is, and this is associated with the idea of putting your house in order, your individual house in order, and then putting your family's house in order, let's say. It's reversed a little bit in this story, because Joseph puts himself together, and then he puts the state of Egypt in order, which is really quite interesting, because Egypt is the canonical tyranny, right, in the Old Testament. And so the idea is very, very clear here that the person who wears the coat of many colors can put the tyranny right. And then the next extension is, well, he has to put his family right. Now, generally the progression would be put yourself right, then put your family right, then put the state right, something like that. It doesn't really, if you can do it in a different order, that's probably okay too. But, so that's what happens at the end of the story, is that, Joseph is doing pretty damn well, and so is the state that he serves. But that isn't good enough for him. He wants his family to be functional. and put together properly, even though they did terrible things to him. And that's very interesting, because once someone does terrible things to you, then the logical thing or a logical thing to think is, well, go to hell in a handbasket, like you deserve exactly what you get. But it's not a very productive attitude, especially if you're around people that you have to be around. So like if it's your family and you go have a family dinner and one of you punches the other and then the other punches you back, and then that's like the family dinner for the next 30 years. It doesn't seem to be very productive, even if you're the person who happened to get in the last blow, because you're going to have to put up with them. At minimum, it might be nice to just let what you can go and work towards making things better. You have to get rid of the idea of revenge and resentment and all those things that you carry along, but it's probably better to think about how your family could be if it was really functioning well, and then just to aim unerringly at that. I know that's not easy. I mean, people are very screwy, and there's no end to the depths of pathology within families. But of course, this story states that very clearly. I mean, they tried to kill him. They sold him into slavery. It's a pathological family. Let's put it that way. But Joseph's attitude is, well, we got to set this right. Not least because of his father, but it isn't only because of his father, as you see as the story unfolds. And the famine was sore in the land. And it came to pass, when they had eaten up the corn which they had brought out of Egypt, their father said unto them, Go again and buy us a little food. And Judah spake unto him, saying, The man did solemnly protest unto us, You will not see my face, except your brother be with you. They can't go back to Egypt without Benjamin. And they said, The man asked us straightly of our state and of our kindred, saying, Is your father yet alive? Have you another brother? And we told him according to the tenor of those words. Could we know that he would say, Bring your brother down? And Judah said unto Israel, his father, Send the lad with me, and we'll arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou, and also our little ones. I will be surety for him. Of my hand shalt thou require him. If I bring him not unto thee and set them before thee, then let me bear the blame forever. Well, so Judah, who played a pretty dismal role in the original selling Joseph into slavery, seems to obviously have learned something by this point, since he's willing to put himself on the line, to take responsibility for the situation and to put himself on the line and to stand in for Benjamin. So he's making himself into a sacrificial object of sorts. And so the game that Joseph's playing, because he's sort of teasing his brothers, but he's also testing them. The game that he's playing is twofold. One is, have you bloody well learned anything, or are you just as corrupt and useless as you were before? That's game number one. And game number two is, maybe if I poke and prod you and put you into a relatively difficult and mysterious situation, I can get you to clue the hell in and adopt some responsibility, and we can move this whole mess forward. And so that seems to be happening. So Judah is taking responsibility, and Reuben did that as well. And the men took presents, and they took double money in their hand, and Benjamin, and rose up and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. And when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the ruler of his house, Bring these men home and slay and make ready food, for these men shall dine with me at noon. And the man did as Joseph bade, and the man brought the men into Joseph's house. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the presents which was in their hand, and bowed themselves again to him to the earth. And he asked them of their welfare, and said, Is your father well, the old man of whom you spake? Is he yet alive? And they answered, Thy servant, our father, is in good health. He's yet alive. And they bowed down their heads and made obeisance. And he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother, of whom ye spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother. And he sought where to weep. And he entered into his chamber and wept there. And he washed his face and went out and refrained himself and said, Set on the bread. And they sat before them. Now he plays another trick on his brothers. So he has them all sit at the table, but he lines them up according to age. And so he's trying to, what is he trying to do? He's trying to freak them out, fundamentally. And he manages that because they have no idea how in the world he could possibly pull something like that off. They think it's magic. And the men marveled at one another. And he took and sent messes unto them from before him. But Benjamin's mess was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So what's he doing? Well, he's testing his brothers again. The fact that when he was the child, Joseph, that he got more meant that his brothers got terribly jealous and then murderous, right? And so now he's doing the same thing with Benjamin. He's thinking, okay, well, I'll give this kid more than his share, and I'll watch how these reprobates behave and see if they've learned anything. And he commanded the steward of his house, saying, fill the men's sack with food as much as they can carry, and put every man's money in the sack as well. And put my cup, the silver cup, in the sack's mouth of the youngest, and his corn money. And the steward did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. As soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away along with their transportation. The cup is found in Benjamin's sack. Well, so Benjamin's kind of young. And Joseph sends out people to find out where the cup is gone, and they find it in Benjamin's sack. And they're very upset about this. They said that a harsh punishment would befall whoever had the cup in his sack. They rent their clothes and laid at every man his ass and returned to the city. Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house, for he was yet there, and they fell before him on the ground, very unhappy and apologetic. And Joseph said unto them, what deed is this that you have done? Don't you know that a man like I can certainly divine? I know what's going on. And Judah said, what shall we say? What shall we speak? Or how can we possibly clear ourselves? God found out the iniquity of thy servants. Behold, we are your servants, both we and also he with whom the cup is found. And he said, God forbid that I should do so, but the man in whose hand the cup is found, he shall be my servant. And as for you, get you up in peace to your father. It's the discovery of the cup. Judah says, now therefore when I come to the servant thy father, my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound up in the lad's life, it shall come to pass when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. And the servants shall bring down the gray hairs of thy servant our father with sorrow to the grave. For thy servant became surety for the lad unto my father, saying, if I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let me stay instead of the lad, and let the lad go with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my brother, and the lad be not with me? Lest peradventure I shall see the evil that will come on my father. Okay, so what's happened? Well, they learned their lesson. So now Judah again is willing to stand in the place of Benjamin and become a slave himself. And so now Joseph has determined that his brothers have developed their character to the point where reconciliation might be possible. You know, it says you should forgive and forget, but the conditions for that are quite specific. You know, if you have a dispute with someone and they've wronged you in some sense, and they apologize, the question is, well, what's the apology? Well, it's a layout of a rationale. It's something like, as far as I can tell, here's the reasons I did this horrible thing, and here's what I've learned from it, and here's what I'm going to do to try not to do it again, and would you give me another crack at it? That's the proper repentance, right? And then you forgive, because you're an idiot too, and you'll probably do something stupid, and maybe you'd like the same kind of break at some point. And besides, if we all held each other completely to account at all possible times for everything, then it'd just be hopeless, because there'd be no room for error. So the forgiveness which Joseph is showing is wise forgiveness. He's not going to put himself out on the line for people who haven't learned, so that the same stupid thing can happen again, so that they can continue to spread misery wherever they go. He's going to find out if they've clued in a little bit, and then if so, then they can move on with putting the family together. And so that breaks him up. He says Joseph could not refrain himself before all of them that stood by him. And he cried. And then he said, get every man away from me. So all the people except for Joseph's brother left. And there stood no man with him while Joseph made himself known unto his brothers. And Joseph said, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And his brothers could not answer, for they were troubled at his presence. It's like, yeah. Understatement of the decade there. And Joseph said unto his brothers, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, who you sold into Egypt. But don't be grieved or angry with yourselves that you sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. So now it was not you that sent me here, but God. And he's made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go to my father and say unto him, thus say thy son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, and tarry not. And thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. And there I will nourish you, for yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all that thou hast come to poverty. So that's the other thing, that another bit of a hint. It's a bread hint here. What's the most reliable source of bread? Well, it isn't bread itself, it's whatever it is that gives rise to bread. And that's what Joseph is in this story. He's the force that gives rise to nourishment. Joseph is often considered a type of Christ, which means like a precursor in some sense. That's one way of thinking about it. And you can see that echoed right there. It's like, well, what do you store up for famine? You store up character. That's the best way through. Now, that doesn't mean you don't also store up bread. And they went out of Egypt and came into the land of Canaan unto Jacob and told him, Joseph is still alive and he's governor. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he didn't believe them. And they told him all the words of Joseph, which he said to them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. And Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob. And he said, here am I. He said, I am God, the God of thy father. Don't fear to go to down into Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. And so that's how the Israelites end up in Egypt. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. And Jacob shall put his hand upon thine eyes. And Jacob rose up from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob, their father, and their little ones, and their wives, in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So the family's now all united in the proper state of being that Joseph has arranged. And they took their cattle and their goods. It's so interesting, too, because, of course, Joseph he's a foreigner as well as being a former slave and prisoner. Foreigner, slave, and prisoner. And yet he ends up ruling Egypt. Sheerly because of the force of his character and competence. And that's really something to think about. And they took their cattle, because the story there is that there isn't anything stronger than that. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are, that there isn't a force that's more powerful than that. And I don't think that that's naive. In fact, I think it's the exact opposite of naive. No matter where you are, you can generally make things better if that's what you want to do. And unless you're in a place that's really hell itself, that usually is something that elevates you and elevates the people around you. And you can do that wherever you are, because there isn't a place that's so small that you can't do that. That's the message of the prison.